I'd like you to turn to Esther, chapter 1. And as I said last week, you blame Carly for this. She's got big shoulders, but I did ask if anyone's got a book or a topic they would like to study or have done. And Carly said, can we have the book of Esther? So we started last week, and it's interesting some of the comments that I got back from the internet. I was fully expecting I would be vetoed by YouTube for some of the things that I've said, but touch wood, so far we're still okay. And last week we talked about how we survive in the age of cancel culture, looking at basically the time in which Esther lived and looking at the Jewish people and how they were a minority and how the Persians had their own agenda and what they wanted to do. And tonight we're looking at the price for saying no. The price for saying no. And we've looked at how basically cancel culture is a culture of bullying. It's based on power. It's not based on truth. And it's about one's own version of the truth and how they see things. And that's what we're seeing happening in our society today. And the practice is to boycott groups or individuals who have expressed opinions or beliefs that do not promote the same narrative to bring about changes in society. And we saw how that worked. I put up charts last week to show you picture or step by step how cancel culture actually works in our society. And we're able to see, yes, this is what's happening largely in our society. And today, it's the experts tell me that saying no can be empowering for some people. Yet for others, it can be intimidating and it can be uncomfortable to say no. There are different times when our society says, look, if you say no, it's impolite, it's not courteous, and it's rude. And because of that, we feel obliged to go with the flow and do things that we don't want to do just to be accepted. We struggle to say no because of what people think and say about us. We struggle to say no when expectations are put on us by our family and friends. It's difficult for us to say no if we believe that by doing so we're going to miss out on something. But there are times when we need to say no simply for our own sanity's sake. But we need to understand that by saying no, it may have some consequences. And today, we're looking at how Vashti, the Persian queen, took a stand. When the system decided to terminate her for making a stand against the established authority, and it cost her to stand upon her principles. So as we look at our thing, there are worksheets out there. The command exercise in these two verses, as we learn, what do you think of Xerxes? Was he a nice bloke? Was he somebody that you'd go out of your way to do things for? He was a dictator, yes. You know, he wasn't a nice person to be around. He was prone to temper tantrums. He was politically inept. He had grand dreams and ambitions. He wanted fame and fortune. He wanted to be known as the King of Kings and take his place on the stage of history amongst the world's greatest leaders, movers and shakers. He also wanted it to be known he was not somebody you took lightly. You didn't mess with him, because he would do whatever it takes to maintain appearances, to impress people with his power and authority. He believed he had the right to tell people what to do, but yet at the same time, he wanted their personal approval as well. In other words, I'll tell you what to do, but you better like me because I tell you what to do. Makes sense, doesn't it? Now, this included his wife Vashti, who was called to appear before the very people he was trying to impress. The expectation was that when the king called you, you came. You didn't refuse his invitation, or it had severe consequences. Now, in our text today, as we read it, we just tend to skip over it, but I want us to understand the tension that existed around the palace, around the king, around the queen, among the elites and the politicians of the time. And I've had to go to extra sources that provided some of that information. It's not in the text, but it provides us with some insights that we can all identify with. But you know, they had to maintain appearances. The king and queen had to maintain appearances. And, you know, they had to maintain it. They didn't want it to get out. And I want us to understand what we're dealing here is real people. They were real people. They had real emotions. There were tensions. There were circumstances in life. And I want us to understand what is happening in our text so that we can identify with it. And as we go to our text in verse 10, there's the atmosphere in verse 10. On the 7th day of the banquet, King Xerxes was very happy because he had been drinking much wine. He gave a command to the 7 eunuchs who served him: Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Agbatha, Zethar, and Carcass. Lovely names, but hey, they were people. They were people. And it's important to understand at this time the atmosphere that was in the palace at this time. Xerxes and his companions were not in the best frame of mind, if you like, when it came to decision making. And the reason being is because the amount of wine they had consumed. Now, let me just state here, this wasn't a casual one-night binge on the booze. These guys had been partying for 6 months. And in those 6 months, they allowed themselves to indulge in anything they wanted. There was nothing that was off limits, and they had become accustomed to being, if you like, in a euphoric state of pleasure. Now you can imagine what if you keep drinking for 6 months, your frame of mind, you're floating, you're fantasizing. This is the frame of mind that we have in the palace. And of course, we understand, and I shouldn't say, but I do, you can understand nothing good comes from a group of men who are in a constant state of inebriation or fantasizing about the best pleasures available to them. And the Jewish Midrash presents the possible topic of discussion that occupied the minds of these men at the time. Remember, they've been drinking and drinking and drinking. And so it came up the question, who is the most beautiful of all the women in the kingdom of Persia? Now you can understand when they've been drinking, the arguments that would go. And some boasted, hey, it's the Persian women, they're the best. No, that's not right. The Median women, they're the best. And here's the king in the midst, he said, you guys have got it wrong. He's not going to be outdone. He says, my wife, and she's not a Mede, and she's not a Persian, but she's Babylonian, and you know what? She is the most beautiful of all. Do you want to see her? So it's giving us the idea of how these thoughts are captured. And of course the men replied, yes, but only if she's naked, as assumed in verse 11, she's wearing only her crown. So this is giving us an idea, and I repeat, this is based upon tradition. It's not declared in our text, but it does provide us with some insights into the situation that we could relate to. We can understand a group of men drinking and what their thought processes would be, and how this situation with Vashti is about to come to fruition because of that discussion. In the next verse, verse 11, he commanded them to bring Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown. She wants to come to show her beauty to the people and important men because she was very beautiful. Now our text states very plainly, Xerxes wanted to show his wife off simply because she was beautiful. But it shows the state of his mind that he was willing to command his wife to do such a thing to impress the people he was with. Now there's many debates about whether she was clothed or unclothed. Most believe it was a command for her to appear naked with just her crown on her head so that people could admire her beauty. Xerxes was exercising his power as a king, and in his euphoric state, now it doesn't say in our text he was drunk, it says he was merry. Now there's merry and there's merry. I'll leave that to your own discussion. But he wasn't drunk when he made this decision to show off, because in his right frame of mind he would never have entertained such an idea to parade his wife before others. Even that went against the normal Persian culture of society, where women were expected to be in seclusion and protected from prying eyes, and they were always to be dressed modestly. That was the culture of the Persians. And here's the king saying, below that, I want to show my wife off. She's beautiful. I want you all to see that. So all the culture, all the customs, when you're the king, you can do whatever you like. I mean, who's going to argue with you? No one. We ask ourselves then, who was Vashti? And there's very little that we know about her from scriptures, except she's here in chapter 1, and then she vanishes, not to be spoken of again. And once again, the Jewish Midrash offers its opinions. It says that she was the great-granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar, the second of Babylon, and the daughter of King Belshazzar, indicating she was Babylonian or Chaldean. It also says Vashti was the orphan daughter of Belshazzar. God was her help, kept her alive, and she was wed to the emperor of Persia and Media, even though she was a Chaldean. In this account of events, on the night that Belshazzar, her father, was killed, Cyrus the Persian and Darius the Mede were guests at his table. The candelabrum fell and dashed out Belshazzar's brains. Darius was crowned in his stead and sat in Belshazzar's customary place. The death of Belshazzar caused total pandemonium in the palace. Some killed while others engaged in looting. Vashti, Belshazzar's daughter, was a young girl, and she was in distress and ran among the guests. Thinking her father was still alive, she mistakenly sat on Darius's lap in the belief that he was her father. Darius took pity on her and married her to his son Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Now remember, Ahasuerus was the Persian name, Xerxes was the Babylonian name for the same son. So that gives us extra information that may or may not have been true, but it's a source from the Jewish accounts. We have the audacity in verse 12. The eunuchs told Queen Vashti about the king's command, but she refused to come, and the king was very angry. His anger was like a burning fire. So here we've got the situation where Xerxes issues a command to the queen to appear before them, and she has the audacity to refuse his request. And of course she says no, and the message comes back. Now remember, he's been drinking for a little while. This is not going to make him a happy little chappy. And in fact, it says his fire burned within him. It wasn't just a short fuse. He had a burning hatred there that she had defied him. Who did she think he was? She was. I'm the king and I've told her to come and do it. And she says no? How dare she? He was losing face before those people he wanted to impress. I mean, here he was the king. He controlled 127 provinces. And yet when it came to his wife, it seems he couldn't control her. His request had been denied. So he gets angrier and angrier because his pride has been deflated. And this is what happens, as we know from studies. The influence of alcohol can go from drunken happiness to intense anger in just a few moments. Now, all the superficial fun, all the frivolity of the 6-month feast is brought to a halt because his wife said no. What great humiliation. Here is the king seeking to show off his power, and he cannot get his wife to obey him. That's a bad look. It really is. Now, when it says that the eunuchs and the important men were told to go and command, not ask, but command that the queen appear, the Jewish Midrash provides some speculation on Vashti's character and how she approached that request. Now remember, these are just traditions and opinions. They're not actually in the text, but it provides us with the possibilities we can identify. And she sent messages back to him in order to persuade him not to do these things. And the first message is that she's supposed to have said, if they see me and think me beautiful, they will want to lie with me and will kill you. And if they see me and think me ugly, you'll be disgraced because of me. In other words, she gave him a hint, don't do it. But he didn't take the hint. The second message, you are my father's steward, and you were accustomed to have naked harlots come before me. Now that you've become king, you've not mended your degraded ways. Wow, that would hurt. The third one, you want me to come naked. Even my father, when he judged litigants in a trial, would not judge them when they were naked. So it gives us the possibilities. Here is a wife trying to reason with her drunken husband or her merry husband who want to impress. You know, using reasoning and logic to appeal to him. But he wasn't having a bar of it. No way. Now, according to the Midrash, she was blessed with wisdom, and she seeks different ways to persuade him to withdraw his request. She appeals to his logic, setting forth all the possible scenarios that might result from this demand. She points out, if you do any of these things, it's to your disadvantage. She addresses his sense of honour and self-respect, demanding that he act as he should be as a king, not in his base desire. And she appeals to his compassion and asks that he not insist upon her appearing naked before all her guests. By means of her messengers, Vashti hints to her husband that he's not considering the consequences of his actions. She's implying that he wields a scepter only because of his marriage to her, and it's not appropriate that he order her to do something that was against her will. Now that's really pushing it. And I can imagine in his merry state, he wasn't going to have a bar of this. Now, despite this depiction in the Midrash, these rabbis find a flaw in her for which she is punished by God and deposed. They assert that Ahasuerus wanted to rebuild the temple, but it was Vashti who stayed his hand. She told him, "You wish to rebuild what my forefathers destroyed." She was therefore punished by the loss of her crown. Xerxes was a slave to his appetite. He had drunk more than what was good for him. And of course, when you drink more than you're supposed to, you make a fool of yourself. He was also a slave to his passions. He was used to being obeyed without question. And he couldn't take being told no, and so this gave way to his anger, and he was no longer in control of his actions. He was also a slave to his pride. He had taken the Queen's refusal as personal. It was against his honour, his dignity was at stake. And remember, I said last week, the Persians most prized appearances. It wasn't based on truth, it was on appearances and impressions. And this is what he valued more. And here she was, humiliating him, and he's losing face. And so that was what was more important than looking after his wife. He wasn't interested in what she was feeling. He wasn't interested in the consequences. He wanted to impress, and she was saying no. But how did Vashti feel? How would you feel if you were in Vashti's situation and your husband told you to do something that you didn't want to do? Would you obey or would you refuse? Think about it. Think about it. Because what was she to think and what was she to do? She had little options available to her. The option was obey or disobey. Both were fraught with dangers, whichever way she went. She was the queen, and she wasn't going to allow herself to be put on public display as a plaything or as a gazing stock for her drunken husband and his friends. Think of the feelings of such a request. Every instinct would be fighting against such a request to be displayed before men who were inflamed with wine. If she valued her modesty, she would say no. But on the other hand, if she was proud of her beauty, she might not have had any problem in showing her beauty off. But the king's command threatened the reputation of Vashti. It was given to the chamberlains in the presence of the princes and nobles. It was delivered to Vashti in the presence of the women. In other words, she was put in a no-win situation. Everybody knew about the king's request. Everybody knew what he commanded of her, and they understood the meaning. Either yes or no. And they understood there were consequences. If Vashti obeyed, she would have lost face and standing as a woman. She would have lost the respect and reverence of the princes and people, and ultimately the king himself. Vashti may have be taken as an example of devotion to just be thought of pure and feeling. But all hazard she did, at all the things she did, what was her true mind and heart would only allow her to do. In other words, she was going to stand upon her principles and she was not going to obey the king. We do not pity her. Whatever the motives that inspired her, our sympathies go with her in a request to obey the king's command. We give her honour as a woman who, in very trying circumstances, was trying to be true to herself and her position. The one act by which she is known has made her name honourable in all time, and it's here in chapter 1. But as far as the king's concerned, he just thought it was rebellion, and it was rebellion from his own household. It was his wife who refused to obey him. This was somebody who was supposed to cooperate and do what was expected of her when asked. It was also a public rebellion. It wasn't something that could be swept under the carpet in private. Everybody knew, everybody was waiting to see what was to happen. This rebellion, if you like, happened at a rather unfortunate time. It came just at the close of the festival, and the Queen failed in submission to her husband's command. Up to this point in time, everything of all the feasting and banquets had gone well. But now, when it seems as though the king was going to impress these princes and elites, it all came undone because Vashti said, "No way." And yet, who do we blame for this rebellion? Who do we blame for this, I guess, sad situation? And if we're honest, there was the king's own stupidity. It wasn't anybody else's fault. He was so full of himself and his ability to impress people, he couldn't take the insult laying down. He was going to make an example. You see, it was his own fault, and this is something that he could easily have avoided if he wasn't full of wine, if he didn't let his anger take control of him. Could have all been taken care of. But no, his wife disobeyed him and she was going to pay. The concern expressed in verses 13 to 15, now he would think that Xerxes would come to his senses, that he'd realise the stupidity of what he was asking, and that he would put his wife in the right position. In other words, I've done the wrong thing. If a bloke's done the wrong thing to his wife, what should he do? How does he make things right? Go and apologise. That's the right thing to do, isn't it? You go and make things right and restore the relationship. In our text, that's exactly what Xerxes didn't do. No way was he going to do it. There's no contrition. There's no accepting of his responsibility in asking the queen what he wanted. His number one concern is about how he's going to come out of this with his integrity intact, while appearing, once again appearances, to do the best for the kingdom. He's not ready to step up to the plate and say, look, I was wrong. I was wrong to allow myself to get drunk in the first place, or I should say merry. I was wrong to make a spectacle of myself and the queen, and I want to apologise to everybody concerned. It won't happen again. That would have fixed everything. No problems. Xerxes was a weak man. He relied on others to give advice. This allowed him to absolve himself of any personal responsibility by blaming others for their failures. And so what does he do? He seeks the counsel of wise men about what he should do. Now, it's plain, just common sense. If you're messed up in your relationship with your wife, go and make it right. You don't have to be intelligent up there. You just know that's the right thing to do. Oh, no, not Xerxes. No, I can't do that. He wants to make sure that he's seen to be doing the right thing. So he goes to the wise men and says, look, I've got a problem here. According to the law of the Medes and Persians, does it have anything to say about a wife who disobeys her husband? Can you find something in the law that I can do about this? So instead of accepting responsibility, he's looking for a loophole. He's looking something that they can find that makes him look good. So that's what he does. And so I'll finish on this one. We'll have to come back next week to finish it off. But it's the assessment. It was the custom for the king to ask advice from experts about law and order. So King Xerxes spoke with the wise men who would know the right thing to do. And I like that. They would know the right thing to do. How would they know the right thing to do? It wasn't them that did it. It was Xerxes did it. But he's asking these wise men because they would know. He's more concerned about appearances once again. He wants to come out on the right side of things with people being impressed with the way that he's handled stuff. You know, that's what's happening in our cancer culture as well. They want to be seen to be doing something. And that's what the philosophy is happening. They don't do much, they talk a lot, but they want to be seen. We'll have a committee, we'll go and ask people what we should do. Instead of making decisions, we'll make the appearance as though we are doing something. And this is what he'd done. So instead of reconciling with his wife, instead of apologising for his behaviour, he's asking these wise men who are experts in the customs and law of the day to make an assessment on what they had found. So instead of doing the right thing, he decides, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stand against my wife. He wants to go with the popular culture of the day. He doesn't want to be different, and he could solve this. He could have just said, as I said before, I'm sorry, I've made a fool of myself and you, I apologise. It doesn't take much, does it? Well, it does if you're a king. If you're somebody in an important position, you've got to eat humble pie. You've got to admit, I was wrong. I did the wrong thing. But you know, we'd get have a lot more respect for leaders and people in positions of authority if they came and said, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Please forgive me. I've got more time for politicians and people like that than people say, nothing to see here, everything's okay, everything's all right, trust me. Right. And the king is no different here. He wants to be loved by everybody, especially those in his kingdom. He's ready to abandon truth for the sake of convenience. He could have saved his marriage. He could have saved everybody the trouble if he just apologised, if he just admitted, I got it wrong. But no, find me a loophole, tell me what I should do to make this right. Now, what does that mean? I will just finish this last one. The assessors. We're told here, the wise men the king usually talked to were Karshina, Shethar, Admathar, Tarshish, Maurice, Marsina, and Memucan. 7 of the most important men of Persia and Media. They had special privileges to see the king and had the highest rank in the kingdom. So these people were important. They were his advisors. Now Xerxes was all about appearances. He wanted to make the right impression with the people he wanted to influence. He was a king. He could have made the decision on his own, and no one would have said a thing. Why? Because they were just glad it wasn't them. It was him. So basically, Xerxes is virtue signaling. He's been humiliated by his wife's disobedience to request. He wanted to save as much face as he could by being seen to do the right thing. He understands and knows that he needs the support of these men if he wants to have his invasion of Greece. Now remember, this whole idea of feasting and preparation was to invade Greece. He needed the elite. He needed the important people in society to be on his side so they would pay for it and approve of it. And that's why he partied, gave them whatever they wanted. So he wasn't going to ruin these chances. So rather than appear the outraged husband who had been told no by his wife, he is putting on his holy appearance and saying, well, it's not for me to be revengeful against my wife. I think you should appraise the situation and tell me what's the best way for me to go about fixing this so it'll be right and proper. You see, he's not interested in accountability. He's not interested in truth. He really wants the matter to go away. It's a big deal to him, so that he could pursue his agenda. And so he seeks the collective wisdom of these men to advise him of the options that are complied with by the law. That would give him room to move in how he applied them. Now, nowhere does it say he looked for biblical counsel. He didn't seek God's counsel. And you know, we see the same thing happening in our society today. How many of our leaders seek the input of God or biblical counsel? I might be able to put it down personal. How many Christians seek the personal input in prayer to find out what God wants them to do and the direction in which he wants them to take them? Our society is moving further and further away from God. And they're seeking people who have their own sphere of interest that's exactly the same and an agenda, and they don't want people to tell them things they don't want to hear. The king didn't want his advisors to tell him the obvious, apologise and make things right, and that'll be the end of it. He didn't want that. He wanted them to be on the same page. So, you know, when a king tells you, as a collective group, find me something in the law to deal with this situation, it's telling me you better find something or you won't be an advisor for very much longer. And don't tell me the obvious, find me something that I can use. So how would you like to be an advisor in this situation to such a king? And we've run out of time, so I will leave it there, but it's just giving you an opportunity to see and understand a little about the tensions, the possible tensions that existed between the king and queen, the political interventions, the ulterior agendas that were all working at the time, because that way we can identify with these people. Their characters, we read them in the Bible, and yet we just brush over them. There's so much we can identify with them in the things that they do, the way they thought, and the tensions that existed. So we can appreciate more why Vashti said no. And we can understand a little bit of the pressures of why, because in our society we're going to be asked to do exactly the same, to stand upon our principles, and it might cost us. It might cost us our lives by standing on the truth. We're living in a society that's not interested in the truth, only if it's their truth, but not the truth of the Bible. And we're living in a culture that is predominantly pagan. We are a minority. We are living in times where people don't seek after God, don't recognize God, and they don't want to hear that God is a solution for their lives. That's truth, but it's not a truth that the world wants to hear. So we can identify with the tensions that are going on. But you'll have to come back next week and find out how it all ends. That's what a good storyteller does, but this is what the account in Scripture tells us as well. And we're going to